Chapter 31. The Trial of Lakhdorian. William watched as the Zarubian performers prepared for their dance, lighting the ends of their staves while some of the others donned their animal skin drums. Lakhdorian never had many visitors from other countries, except those from the northern kingdoms travelling down to Oxgate. Even then, most travellers would skip Lakhdorian. It wasn't until he'd come to Oxgate that he'd realised how multicultural their country actually was. He was suddenly pulled from his thoughts by Kane kicking his chair. "Eat," said Kane, nodding towards William's now extremely tepid bowl of porridge. William let out a sigh. "I'm not hungry, I just—" began William. "Eat," repeated Kane. William nodded obediently and began force-feeding himself the porridge. He'd barely eaten anything all day. His nerves were beginning to get the better of him, and food was the last thing on his mind. Kane was becoming increasingly irritable throughout the day, too. Apparently having to sit around making sure that William didn't run away was not his idea of a fun assignment. His team of black riders had recently arrived too, in merrier spirits than Kane, to say the least. They were in charge of making sure that the beast was safely released into the arena with William. After this, Kane and his troops' duties would be fulfilled, and they'd be able to go off frolicking in whorehouses and whatever else the Viper Squad got up to for fun. The audience erupted into applause shortly before the dwarf comedian playwrights returned from the arena. They wore proud smiles and were abuzz with excitement as they discussed amongst themselves how well their performance had gone. William took a deep breath to try to steady his nerves. With every one of these performances, William was one step closer to having to go out there himself. The Zarubian dance troupe would be the final act before William's trial. As both performances required the sun to be down, with dusk falling, these were to be the finale of the show. "Prince Alexander is here," exclaimed the playwrights to the dance troupe excitedly. "And the king?" asked the dancers eagerly. The dwarves shook their heads. William supposed a crudely erected arena out in the Bleaklands was probably not quite regal enough of a setting for a king. He was surprised to hear that the prince was even here. As he watched the dance troupe preparing to step out into the arena, he suddenly felt a hand slap roughly down on his shoulder. "How are we doing?" asked August haughtily, having a hand on both William and Kane's shoulders. Neither of them said a word, simply staring up at Sir August, William with surprise and Kane with disdain. "That good, huh?" asked August, letting out a sigh. He pulled a seat up next to William. "So they've appointed you to guard him while I release the thing, is that right?" asked Kane. "Yes, exactly," August nodded affirmatively. Kane let out a sigh. "Needless. The kid isn't going anywhere. They've made all the other knights turn up here with their weapons anyway. They could have appointed anyone." "Why does it need to be us?" asked Kane despondently. "Oh, come now. The others aren't really on duty. They're just here to make the college look more impressive. I'm here with the boy because I volunteered to be. You needed to be here for the unboxing of the beast anyway," reasoned August. He turned to William. "How are you holding up?" he asked. William shrugged, as he couldn't find the words to express how panicked he was feeling. "Well, it's good to see that you've eaten something. Fighting on an empty stomach is a bad idea," said August. William realized at this moment that beneath it all, Kane might actually have his best interests at heart too. "We have an hour before dusk becomes dark enough for that beast to come out," said Sir August, looking at the crate sitting silently in the corner, still covered with a canvas. William raised an eyebrow. "Why does it have to be so dark?" asked William. "They can't be out in the sunlight. They hate it," replied Kane. "What does it matter if it hates the sunlight or not?" asked William. Kane let out a sigh. "Listen, kid, your fight is going to be easy enough as it is. Quit your whining," he said, standing from his chair and walking over towards the refreshments table. "You've nothing to worry about, William. Just remember to breathe and use what I've taught you," said August. William nodded, hoping that he could actually pull off the techniques that August had taught him. As the dancers got into the crux of their performance, William let out a deep sigh. It was almost time. This was it. He was finally going to have to fight that thing. Would he have what it takes, or was August going to have to run in there and save him after all? Eric tapped his foot nervously as he watched the dancers twirling their staves around and breathing fire in the air. Ordinarily, this event would have captivated him, but the knowledge that William would come out next was the only thing on his mind. He played idly with the trinket in his pocket, which still somehow felt like it was getting hotter. Was it just because he couldn't stop touching it? "Eric!" called out a voice suddenly. Eric looked down the stands to see Maud and Gerald sidling their way towards him. He shifted to his left, making room for them to come and join him. Once they'd managed to edge their way past the disgruntled crowd, Maud caught Eric with a hug and gave him a kiss on the cheek. "How are you holding up, son?" asked Gerald. Eric let out a deep, shaky breath but nodded his head. "I'm doing okay. These dancers are almost finished, then William's up next," said Eric, closing his eyes and shaking his head. "I'm sure he'll be fine. He's a strong lad," said Maud, holding Eric's hand. Eric nodded his head and smiled at her appreciatively. He'd never seen the two of them in their fanciest garb before. He'd never even seen them out of the clothes that they worked in. "Who's watching over the inn?" asked Eric, suddenly realizing that with both of them here, there wasn't anyone there to keep the place running. "Closed for the night," said Gerald distractedly, watching the fire dancers in awe. "First time since we've owned the place," said Maud with a smile, watching the amazing performance in front of them. Eric felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched these two people who he'd come to adore. He and William really hadn't been in Oxgate for very long, but they'd already somehow found a family here. He looked back down at the arena and immediately felt worry churning in his gut again. William had to do this. If he didn't, there was not going to be anywhere for him to stay in Oxgate. Eric would still be enrolled in the college, but William would have nowhere to go. He couldn't rely on Sir Ivar's charity forever. The second that he won or lost this fight, Ivar would be settling his bond with the Blue Lantern Inn. That was for sure. It wouldn't be fair to ask Maud and Gerald to let him stay for free. William had no home to return to. His whole life rested on this battle. He had to win. He just had to. He didn't have a choice. With an amazing finale involving backflips and calisthenics, the dancers sprayed an enormous fan of fire out of their mouths, earning themselves a standing ovation. Eric barely even had it in him to applaud. As he watched the dancers taking their leave, he knew that this meant it was time. William was finally going to be facing off against the monster. Kane and the Viper Squad suddenly appeared at the side of the arena, wheeling out the enormous crate from backstage as they prepared for William's trial. A rack with a selection of sharp, high-quality-looking weapons was assembled on the opposite side of the arena as the monster was wheeled into place. Eric stared intently at the crate. Just what would this creature look like? Sir August had not been able to give them a description due to it being forbidden knowledge. It wouldn't be forbidden for long. After tonight, everybody would be talking about what the monster looked like. "Ouch," said Maud suddenly, pulling her hand back from him and rubbing it. Eric turned and looked at her quizzically. "What have you got in your pocket, love? Hot coal?" asked Maud. The pocket of his loose robes had been dangling over the seat, and Maud had touched the trinket within. He reached down and placed a finger on it, immediately pulling back when he realized that it was hot to the touch. What did it mean, and why was it happening now? With the torches around the sides of the arena being lit, William knew this meant that in mere moments he would be locked inside that cage. "Come on, it's time," said August, handing William his chainmail coif. William nodded accepting the coif, reluctantly standing from his seat and taking a shaky step towards the gate of the arena. Sir August looked at him and raised an eyebrow before placing a hand on William's shoulder. "Breathe, son. This is just like our training. What you're feeling now will pass. You need to calm yourself down so that you can hold your sword strong. Think of your family and friends. Let them give you strength," said Sir August, holding his other hand in a fist. Surprisingly, his words actually did strike some courage into William. Immediately, an image of his father flashed before his eyes, hammering away at a horseshoe on his anvil back at home. He had managed to stay strong and brave right down until his final breath. He'd died trying to keep his family safe. If he'd had to fight this thing, there's no way he'd have had the shakes like William did right now. He took a deep breath, nodding understandingly at Sir August. "Lakhdorian!" called out one of the organizers, signaling that it was time for him to enter the arena. William looked up at August, who nodded, removing his hand from William's shoulder. This was it. Showtime. The second that they saw young William walking onto the stage beside the lion himself, the crowd subdued into a quiet, whispered chatter. Next to the giant knight, William looked positively tiny. "Oh," said Maud, putting her hands over her mouth when she saw William. "That must be awfully heavy," said Gerald, shaking his head as he looked at William's chainmail armor and coif. They watched on as the young boy was led to the opposite end of the arena, to the giant box. Eric couldn't think of a word to say. He could immediately see in William's gait that he was struggling under the cumbersome mail, but he also noticed his lack of confidence. Eric wished that he could jump into that arena and help him fight the thing, but the giant metal bars around the arena would prevent him from making entry even if he were of smaller stature. When William and August came to a stop, August put his hands on William's shoulders and said something to him that they couldn't hear. William seemed to be nodding along and breathing heavily, not being able to keep his eyes off of the giant crate on the other side of the arena. "Shouldn't Sir August be wearing armor himself?" asked Eric, noticing that Sir August was wearing a fancy tunic. "Maybe that's a good sign," said Gerald. Eric looked at him searchingly. "Maybe it means that the monster isn't really that tough," he elaborated, narrowing his eyes as he looked at the box, which still sat silently on its side of the arena. Eric nodded, taking one last shaky breath himself as Sir August slapped William on the shoulders encouragingly before taking his leave back to the waiting area on the other side of the gate. Eric couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed Maud's hand and held it tight. She squeezed his hand back, both of them looking down on William in the arena with worry gripping their hearts. As the gates dropped, leaving but William and the crate in the arena, this was it. There was no turning back now. William could barely take his eyes off of that terrifying crate on the other side of the arena. There were ropes attached to its lid which, when pulled from the other side of the gate, would allow the crate to collapse, revealing whatever lay inside it. As he saw the gate on the far side of the arena being closed, he realized that this was it. There was truly no escape. After a few moments, he heard a sudden whistle. He turned his head and saw one of the event organizers on the other side of the bars. "Choose a weapon! Hurry up!" he urged, looking up at the lavish box of seats at the top of the stands housing the aristocrats. William nodded, realizing that everybody was waiting for him. When he approached the weapon rack, he noticed that he actually had quite an assortment of fancy-looking equipment to choose from. Swords, spears, hammers, there was even a halberd. William took the longsword, as this was the only weapon he'd had even the remotest practice with. It was considerably heavier than his wooden training sword, but August had made him practice swinging the real thing around enough that it didn't surprise him too much. After coming to terms with its weight, he took one final deep breath. He looked back at the event organizer and slowly nodded his head. He was as ready as he'd ever be. As the organizer gave the signal to Kane and his troop, William bent his knees, getting into a defensive position. He had no idea what was about to be revealed in that box, but whatever it was could possibly launch itself at him the moment it was revealed. Suddenly, the ropes were yanked back with a giant heave from the Viper Squad. Just like that, the lid of the crate suddenly flew open, with the walls falling down around it. What William saw revealed inside immediately sent a wave of shock and confusion spreading through his stomach. There, scuttling around on the spot, panicking at its newly exposed surroundings, was a moor crawler. Chapter 32. No Way Out. The second that the creature was revealed, the crowd gasped in horror at what they beheld. Some screamed, others cried out in shock, some simply sat in silence, struggling to fathom what they were beholding. Eric stared down at the moor crawler with his mouth agape. The moor crawlers were gateway monsters? How could that be possible? How could there have been gateway creatures wandering around his farm all this time without the kingdom knowing? Maud suddenly clutched onto his hand even tighter than before. It was her first time seeing a moor crawler, so Eric empathized with how scary it must look. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or even more scared. After seeing what those creatures were capable of in that gypsy camp, his gut was filled with unease. Despite this, memories of cutting them into pieces and feeding them to his pigs flooded back into his mind, rendering his fears slightly abated. "Why does it look so—" began Maud. "Human," finished Gerald. The moor crawler seemed to be in its default sheepish state that Eric was more familiar with. It scuttled about a little, turning every which way as it looked for an exit, and slowly fathomed that it was trapped. People had come here expecting a monster which would immediately launch itself at William, ripping and tearing at him with unheard-of speed and strength. What they got instead was a terrified moor crawler, tearing up fistfuls of grass as it prepared to dig itself into the ground in fear of the crowd. Eric was the only one here who wasn't still in shock from its initial appearances. How long would it be until the rest of the crowd noticed how pathetic it truly was? Memories of watching the gypsies being torn to shreds were flooding back into William's mind. He couldn't underestimate this thing, but still he felt a dull feeling of relief flowing into his chest. They were dangerous foes, yes, but they were also familiar to him. It was beginning to dig into the ground, throwing tufts of grass and dirt over its back as it hurriedly tried to hide from the crowd. It still wore that dull, empty, expressionless look on its face. That was a good sign. He just needed to strike it before it managed to undergo whatever transformation it had undergone at the gypsy camp. He raised his longsword and began to march determinedly towards it, staying in stance like August had taught him. He could hear the crowd beginning to erupt into concerned murmurs. It wouldn't be long before they realized how short of a fight this might actually be. William didn't care. All he cared about was ending this as quickly as he could, and now was the perfect time to strike. William tentatively pressed his offensive march. After a few strides, the beast finally seemed to take notice of him, stopping its digging and freezing in place while its giant black empty eye sockets looked up at him inquisitively. It seemed tensed up, ready to retreat at any moment. William took a deep breath, continuing to press forward towards the monster. It tilted its head, leaning forward towards William and inspecting him curiously. Suddenly, William felt a strange vibration and warmth in his chest. He had no idea what he was feeling, but it made him pause on the spot. He wanted to look down and inspect whatever was happening in his body, but he couldn't take his eyes off of the creature, which was now taking curious small steps towards him. "Hey!" exclaimed William defensively, trying to startle the creature to start backing away from him again, which seemed to work for a moment as it drew to a halt. It was only for a brief moment, though, as it immediately began crawling towards him again, its face fixated on him. "Hey!" exclaimed William again, more loudly this time, taking half a step backwards as panic began to creep into his heart. This time the crawler was unfazed. "That's right," whispered Anne-Marie in William's ear suddenly. The crowd was beginning to erupt into louder murmurs as the creature continued walking towards William, catching him in a steady retreat. As the moor crawler continued its approach, William began swinging his sword out in front of him every now and then, trying to make the beast flinch. As the blade came closer to it, the crawler would lean back slightly, but it never stopped its approach. William's fear suddenly escalated as he realized that he was being backed into a corner. "That's right," whispered Anne-Marie again. William swiped out at the moor crawler, yelling as he did so, but it was no use. As his fear heightened, he suddenly tripped over the uneven Bleakland's earth, falling backwards into the grass. He cried out in fear, the crowd joining him, releasing a surprised choir of screams as he fell. He immediately tried to right himself, but the moor crawler didn't hesitate for a second. It jumped forward, reaching out and grabbing his leg with one of its front arms, that horrible, strong grip that had left wounds in Eric's sides, dug into William's leg. He screamed out in pain and fear, swiping down with his longsword at the creature's hand. He managed to connect with its forearm, slashing it shallowly. It wasn't a major wound, but it was enough to make it release his leg, buying him just enough time to pull back and try to get up onto his feet. The moor crawler screeched in pain, its face beginning to twitch away from the dull, vacant expression. William had to end this now. He couldn't let whatever had happened at that gypsy camp happen again. He leaped forward, taking a strong high cut down towards the creature from above his head. The moor crawler reared backwards defensively. It was fast, but not fast enough. William's strike ploughed down into its torso. It screeched, scuttling backwards away from William. The crowd cheered jubilantly as William made his first real progress towards defeating this thing. He finally let a little courage flow back into his heart. Maybe he could do this after all. "That's enough," whispered Anne-Marie suddenly. William instantly felt that heat in his chest erupt once again. His grip on his sword weakened as he put his other hand up to his chest, trying to feel what was happening. The crowd began to murmur as they realized that something was wrong with William. He dropped down to one knee, resting on his sword with his right hand while his left clutched at his chest. Pain was beginning to flow from his chest and down into his limbs with every heartbeat. The moor crawler seemed to suddenly take intense interest in William. Rather than backing away, it simply froze on the spot, its head tilting curiously as the heat in William's chest intensified. His vision began to blur, fading to white as a migraine started pounding in his head. Visions of his room back in Lakhdorian suddenly started flashing before his eyes. "What are you doing to me?" cried out William, shaking his head to try to bring himself back to the present. Every time that the present flashed back before his eyes, he could see the moor crawler drawing closer, that curious face with its tilting head drawing nearer and nearer. "William," whispered Anne-Marie from the end of his bed. "No!" yelled William, trying to stave off the vision which was being thrust upon him at the worst possible moment. As the white-hot pressure in his chest reached its peak, he suddenly realized that his left arm was moving on its own. It was rising up, open-palmed towards the moor crawler. No matter how hard William tried, he couldn't pull it back down. The moor crawler seemed to be twitching its entire body uncomfortably. Its brows started furrowing, its dull eye sockets darkened, and its face began to twitch sporadically. Its expression twisted into that countenance of pure hatred that they'd been wearing that night in the gypsy camp. It began releasing a disgusting, throaty growl as its body pulsated as though energized by something. All William could do was watch on in horror as his own arm continued to stretch out towards the moor crawler, seemingly inciting this transformation. He needed to get a grip. He needed to overpower this dark force and take control of the battle. He needed to end this, and fast. William cried out at the top of his lungs with exertion, trying his absolute hardest to stand up. As he did, he dropped his sword from his right arm, reaching over towards his left arm and pulling it down as hard as he could. As he struggled, he could feel the pain in his chest and his head lessening. He slowly felt control returning to his left arm as he pulled it down. It was working. With one final cry, William pulled down with all his might, finally managing to regain control of his entire body. But it was too late. When he looked up at the Moorcrawler in front of him, he beheld that familiar, terrifying visage of pure wrath and hatred. William gulped in fear, hearing its guttural growling as it stared at him with absolute malice. Would he have time to reach down for his sword? He had to. It was the only way he could get out of this alive. He took a deep breath before slowly lowering down towards his sword. The very moment that he began to move, however, the Moorcrawler let out a howling shriek, galloping towards him at a blistering speed far faster than it would have been capable of mustering previously. It leapt at him with its arms outstretched, still releasing its guttural cry. William dropped down onto his hands and knees, sending the Moorcrawler flying over his head. He reached down towards the hilt of his sword, but immediately felt a pressure on his head. The Moorcrawler had grabbed the back of his mail coif with its furthest back arms as it sailed over his head. Still holding on as it fell, it yanked William backwards down onto the ground with it, his coif being pulled from his head in the process. It quickly turned back around to face him with superhuman speed. William had no time to react, as one of the creature's other arms immediately came crashing down, grabbing towards William's face. He rolled quickly to the side, narrowly avoiding the hand which futilely tore a great fistful of grass from where his head had just been. He managed to get onto his hands and knees, launching himself backwards just in time to dodge another mighty attack from the Moorcrawler that came crashing down where he'd just been sitting moments ago. With the Moorcrawler now on top of his dropped sword and the weapon rack behind the creature, William suddenly realized how much trouble he was in. He had no weapon, his coif was gone, and the monster was in the same terrifying state that it had been in at the gypsy camp. What was he possibly going to be able to do here? Cain jumped up from his chair, joining Sir August, who was pressed up against the arena bars, watching on in shock at the scene which was unfolding before them. "I've never seen them behave like this before," said Sir August, reaching instinctively for the sword at his hilt. "Nor have I," said Cain, a dark expression appearing on his face. "I've got to go in there. This is too much," said Sir August, turning to run towards the gate. Cain grabbed him by the arm, stopping him in his tracks. "What are you doing?" asked Sir August, looking between Cain and the scene unfolding in the arena. "You dishonor the boy," said Cain, his dark expression deepening as he watched the terrifying scene before them. Sir August gritted his teeth. "Look at him!" shouted Sir August. William was backing away towards the remains of the crate that had previously been holding the Moorcrawler, narrowly dodging attacks by the skin of his teeth. "He's unarmed," exclaimed Sir August, pulling his arm back from Cain. "Give him a chance," said Cain, without looking away from the fight. August took a deep breath, looking at Cain's serious expression. He turned back towards the fight and watched on with his hand on his sword. He'd give William one last chance to prove himself against this mysteriously invigorated foe. At the first sign that things were escalating, August was going in there. William jumped to the right as the Moorcrawler launched itself at him, narrowly missing him once more. For once, William's small stature and strong muscles were coming in handy. He was exceptionally fast. Fast enough that even when faced with this superhuman beast, he was managing to stay alive somehow. He suddenly felt something beneath his foot. He looked down and saw the remains of the crate. He didn't waste a second, picking up a large piece of crate to use as a shield. It was just in time, as the Moorcrawler came leaping out directly towards him at that exact moment. William managed to heave the enormous piece of wood up at the beast, blocking its attack and deflecting it off to his right side. The moor crawler quickly righted itself, spinning around to face him and lunging towards his shield. It smashed straight through the piece of wooden crate, cracking it into 2 pieces and out of William's hands. William cried out in fear, stumbling for a moment to steady himself on his feet. He noticed that now he'd managed to rotate the fight, he might be able to make a mad dash for his sword. He didn't have a second to waste, immediately breaking into the most ferocious sprint of his life. The moor crawler let out another guttural cry, scurrying after him with terrifying haste. William grunted in frustration at the heavy mail that he was wearing. He could see his sword just out of his reach. If he had been unarmored, he'd have been able to make it on time, but as he glanced over his shoulder, he immediately saw that the moor crawler was upon him. He leapt forward, reaching for the sword, but just as he did, the moor crawler grabbed his legs, pulling him back in mid-air and sending him crashing roughly to the ground. William screamed in horror, kicking as hard as he could against the giant hands that were wrapped around his legs, but it was no use. As he kicked and screamed, William could feel himself being pulled closer and closer to the monster. He reached out desperately for his sword, grabbing handfuls of mud and grass as he was pulled further and further away from it. Now that it had pulled him underneath it, the moor crawler grabbed him and flipped him over so that he was face up. It released a disgusting shriek down over William's face. William wailed in fear as he struggled feebly against the moor crawler, but it was useless. Against such a monstrosity he stood no chance. As William watched the creature rearing up, he knew that it was over. "That's enough!" bellowed Sir August, pulling out his sword and charging over towards the gate. The moment that he grabbed it, however, he knew that something was wrong. As he pulled against it, he suddenly noticed a bundle of thick chain with a padlock wrapped around the gate. "Who put this here?" shouted August, looking around searchingly. "I did," said the rector, stepping out from the shadows. August's face dropped in shock. "What is the meaning of this?" cried out August, looking between the rector and William, who was by now entirely beneath the moor crawler as it released its cry. "They must see the true horror of the gateway. Only then will they understand why we need the knights," said the rector, a dark expression covering his face as he watched William in his final moments. August couldn't believe that this was happening. William was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. Chapter 33. Survivor's Guilt. The moor crawler reared up, lifting its front arms up above its head. This was it. This was how he died. It had grabbed his legs with its back set of arms and pinned his arms down against the ground with its middle set. He was completely defenseless. The moment that the moor crawler released its first strike down on William's torso, he immediately felt his ribs break beneath the mail armor he was wearing. Searing pain shot through his entire body as the devastating blows collided with him. He let out a squeaking cry as his ribs were smashed in, blood erupting from his mouth as his chest cavity was punctured. Before he even had a chance to reel from the first attack, the moor crawler continued. It released a hail of blows against William's chest and body, breaking bones and spilling blood even through the mail. William gargled through a mouthful of blood as fear and pain overwhelmed him while he looked up helplessly at the creature on top of him. The crowd screamed with horror as they watched young William becoming more and more dishevelled with every blow. With one final shriek, the moor crawler raised its right arm up and released a heavy blow across William's cheek, taking a chunk of his face off in the process. With this final strike, William's world faded to black. "William!" screamed Eric, looking down helplessly as William was torn to shreds by the monster. It was like his world was in slow motion. This couldn't really be happening. It couldn't. Maud held him back as he tried to climb over the barrier and into the arena. There was nothing he could do. William was gone. Sir August watched on in horror as William was being demolished by the moor-crawler. "Let me in!" demanded August, slamming the gate in anger. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that," said the rector. Sir August reached out, grabbing the rector by the throat and pinning him up against the bars behind him. "Let me in!" demanded Sir August. As the rector gasped for breath, a pair of guards started pulling at Sir August's shoulders to make him release the man. August ignored them, easily overpowering them and slamming the rector up against the bars even harder. "Where is the key?" bellowed August. My pocket," croaked the rector, feebly reaching for the key in his pocket as he was choked by the giant knight. August grabbed the key from the rector's hand, throwing him down to the ground and turning back to the padlock on the gate. When he looked up, he knew it was already too late. William lay on the ground, completely motionless, the moor-crawler staring down over him curiously like a cat with a mouse. August's shoulders slumped in defeat. With the key halfway into the lock, he felt goosebumps run down his arms. He released a cry of fury and frustration, punching the gate roughly as the reality dawned on him. It was over. He'd failed. Ash danced in the air as the world crumbled around them. The walls collapsed in the storm as only the final, fundamental pieces of him remained. William lay in his bed, coughing up mouthfuls of blood which spilled down into his sheets, leaving them a slick, crimson mess beneath him as he twisted and churned in agony. Anne-Marie placed a hand on his cheek and looked down over him with a deafeningly blank expression on her beautiful face. William tried to speak, but all that came out was a mouthful of blood, erupting from his mouth and down his chin. "You're dying," said Anne-Marie quietly, still with her hand on his cheek as she sat on the side of his deathbed. He watched as she lifted her gaze to the window, her empty stare falling on the storm raging outside. She held up her hand and watched as it too began to be blown away, just like everything else. Her skin was falling away into motes of dust, blown away into the storm. "You're dying too," coughed William, a wry smile appearing on his face as he watched her looking down at her hand. Without moving her head, her gaze shifted up to stare him in the eyes. "Am I?" she asked, looking over at the wardrobe which, despite showing signs of degradation, was still standing strong. William continued to cough through his broken ribs, staring up at her pretty face. "If I die, you die with me," murmured William. Anne-Marie sat up straight and let out a sigh. She shrugged. "Who knows?" she asked flatly, standing up and walking over to the window, gazing out of it with her hands held casually behind her back. "We'll soon find out," gargled William, coughing another mouthful of blood down over his chest. "What about your friends, your family?" asked Anne-Marie, not looking away from the window. William's expression darkened as he thought back to Eric. Even his family back home in Lakhdorian flashed before his eyes. Aunt Genevieve digging away in her garden, Uncle Wilton churning away at his green cheese, little Sasha with her nose buried deep in a book. Even Maud and Gerald made an appearance, Sir August too. William let out a dull sigh. "They're better off without me," he said earnestly. "Are you sure?" asked Anne-Marie cryptically. William snapped his head back up to look at her as a sick feeling erupted in his stomach. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying his best to sit more upright in his bed, but immediately having the pain from his chest erupt over his body and send him back down. "Can't you feel them?" asked Anne-Marie, slowly walking back over to his bed and sitting beside him. "Look," she said, placing a hand over his eyes, encouraging him to close them. For a moment, all William saw was darkness, but then he felt it. He was connected to something. It was like he was connected to a hive mind. He could feel moor crawlers. There must have been 30 of them. They were encroaching on the arena, unseen in the dead of night, as all eyes were on William, gargling his final breaths. They were being drawn to something that was glowing like a beacon within Eric's very own pocket. "No," murmured William. "They were some of his first creations. So rudimentary," said Anne-Marie. Suddenly another vision filled William's mind. He was in some kind of butchering room. Meat hung on all of the walls, dangling from hooks and hanging on racks. The floor was covered with blood, entrails, and meat too. A cacophony of moans, wails, and screams filled William's ears. As he looked around the grotesque scene, he suddenly realized what was actually happening here. The meat was people. They hung from hooks, some dead, others not. Most were missing limbs, others sat entirely or half vivisected, organs partially removed or missing as they bled out, their innards mixing with the steadily growing carpet lining the floor of the room. "It began with a simple idea," echoed Anne-Marie's voice. Suddenly the door of the dungeon crashed open, and what William beheld entering through it earned from him a whimper of horror. The creature that entered seemed to be made entirely of exposed flesh and bones. It had a disgusting tangled web of nonsensical appendages that it used to struggle its way into the room. It looked 8 feet tall at least, and its fleshy mass of a body could barely be squeezed through the door. Grotesque, tumorous pustules across its body burst as it forced itself through the narrow passageway. Kicking and screaming within some of its more hand-like appendages were 2 beaten and bloodied men. What remained of their outfits seemed to bear the sigils of knightly orders. William gasped in horror as he watched them flailing about feebly within the vile appendages of the horrendous monster that was holding them. "What if we could create more of ourselves?" asked Anne-Marie's voice. The creature threw the 2 men down on the butcher's table, pressing them up against one another roughly and comparing the lengths of their limbs. The 2 men were of quite similar dimensions. The monster seemed pleased. One of its bonier appendages was suddenly brandished above the men. Before they could even react, it had begun hacking and sawing roughly away at their extremities. As the 2 men shrieked in agony, William covered his eyes and ears, curling up into a ball in the corner next to another half-alive victim of the disgusting monstrosity. It didn't work, of course, but what he did create was something new. "Neither human nor us," said Anne-Marie as the vision faded back to black, and William was once again being shown the moor crawlers as they stalked through the night, encroaching ever closer to the arena. "Stop!" cried out William desperately. The vision ended, and he was brought back to reality, lying in his deathbed with Anne-Marie looking down over him. What little remained of the room would be blown away like the rest of this world in mere moments. "Stop! I can't stop them. They've been waiting here for their master to return for all these years. They've been drawn out of hiding by a power that was stolen from him and sealed within a certain stone," said Anne-Marie, unable to hide a smile that appeared on her face as William realized that she was talking about the Rothmane trinket that Eric had in his very pocket. "Please! You have to stop them!" begged William desperately as he fathomed the mortal peril Eric was mere moments away from facing. Anne-Marie let out a sigh. "These simple creatures may have mistaken me for him, but alas, I have no control over them," said Anne-Marie nonchalantly, patting William on the cheek. "Please, stop them," said William, tears rolling from his eyes as he envisioned Eric being torn apart by those horrendous monsters. "How am I to stop them if I'm stuck out here? You won't let me in," explained Anne-Marie, gesturing around at the ever-diminishing world around them. William closed his eyes, trying to hold back his tears of defeat. She'd done it. She'd won. He couldn't take it. The idea of Eric still being plagued by the remnants of William's presence even after his death. He couldn't die knowing that Eric was mere minutes away from suffering the same fate as him. "Fine," said William dejectedly. Anne-Marie tilted her head, looking down at him searchingly. "Say it properly," she said, her expression darkening, the glee of being able to twist this memorable quote of Anne-Marie's to its evil bidding evident on her face. "I'll let you in, but you have to promise to save them. Save them all," said William. Anne-Marie beamed with joy as she began to assume her terrifying monstrous form. Once again, it was as though she was formed entirely of shadow. Her hair turned black, and her foot-long dark claws extended out menacingly. Her eyes glowed that familiar deep red as a tangled web of shadowy tendrils extended all around her like wings. "Oh, but I have so much to accomplish," she said, beginning to float menacingly over William's limp body. "I'll only let you in if you promise to kill them. Every last one," said William as he began to lose consciousness. "Nothing would bring me more joy," said Anne-Marie, beginning to slowly float down onto William. As his world faded to black, the last thing he saw was that horrendous, bastardized rendition of Anne-Marie's beautiful face as it lowered down on top of him with a twisted, evil grin. "Have this man arrested!" demanded the rector, pointing at Sir August. The guards looked between the two of them for a moment, not sure of exactly what to do. "It looked like the rector tripped to me," said Kane suddenly from behind Sir August. The rector gaped his mouth silently, trying to find the words to protest what Kane was saying. "Wouldn't you agree, boys?" asked Kane. The guards exchanged a glance, looking at the two enormous knights of legend stood before them. They both nodded in agreement, stepping away from the rector. "What? This is preposterous! An outrage! An assault has been committed!" spluttered the rector. "Wait," said Sir August suddenly. He was looking through the bars at William. Kane had seen it too. William had moved. He was still alive. Kane joined August by his side. As he stood looking through the bars, his expression darkened. "Hurry now, lion," said Kane quietly. August suddenly snapped back to reality, fumbling for the key and inserting it into the padlock hurriedly. Hope wasn't lost. Not yet. As Eric sobbed uncontrollably, holding onto the bars and staring down at his dear dead friend, Maud and Gerald tried their best to console him. The audience was abuzz with concerned chatter, all moved by what they'd just witnessed. "He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve any of it," cried Eric, tears streaming down his face as he stared at William's maimed corpse. Maud was crying too much herself to be able to effectively console him, continuing to simply rub his back comfortingly. "We know, sweetheart, we know," she managed to stammer. The moor-crawler lingered over him, staring down at his face curiously, tilting its head like a fox, listening for a rodent under the snow. Suddenly, inexplicably, the strong smell of tansies mixed with some kind of rancid odour erupted over the entire arena. Eric stopped crying, his memories of the last time he smelled this concoction flooding back into his mind. William's eyes snapped back open and his head tilted up to look at the moor-crawler. Before it had a chance to react, with its grip on his arms now released, William reached straight up into its face, inserting his fingers deep into its eye sockets. The moor-crawler let out a gut-churning shriek as William tightened his grip, pulling down the creature's face with brutal force and throwing it down into the mud. As he slid his legs out from under the beast, he lifted his other hand and pressed down on the back of its head, pressing its face down into the ground as he got up onto his feet. The audience watched on in a stunned silence, nobody knowing quite what they were witnessing. Once on his feet, William stamped down hard on the back of the moor-crawler's head, again plunging its face roughly down into the dirt and breaking its jaw. It let out a garbled shriek as its limbs flailed around desperately. "What is he? How is he?" stammered Eric. William took a step back from the moor-crawler, giving it a chance to ready itself for a counterattack. With another shriek, it launched itself straight at him. William ducked down, picking up the long sword from the ground and readying it in anticipation. With extraordinary speed he raised the sword up directly towards the moorcrawler, which was still in mid-air from its leap. It was unable to adjust its course, barreling straight down into the blade and releasing a shriek of pain. He's doing it!" exclaimed Gerald excitedly. The crowd was beginning to erupt into a dull applause as they witnessed what William was somehow managing to pull off. He followed through the attack, charging forwards with the moorcrawler impaled on his blade, carrying the monster toppling over backwards with his momentum and planting its back on the floor. William shoved down hard on the blade, impaling the monster to the ground. It shrieked and flailed about like a bug on its back, its many hands reaching for the sword, impaling it into the ground, but not being able to reach it. As August and Cain burst into the arena, August immediately went to run to William's aid, but Cain grabbed him by the arm, holding him back. "The battle isn't over yet," warned Cain, looking at the scene before them. William's head snapped up to look at them. His eyes looked to be a deep black, with a dull crimson depth to them. The eye on the damaged half of his face was so bloodied that it was hard to see, but he was clearly staring straight at the two knights menacingly. An insidious grin appeared on William's broken face as he stared at them. August held out a hand. "Okay, you've done it. It's over. Just try to relax now," he said, feeling that same darkness in William that he'd seen during their first sparring match. William turned away from the moorcrawler, which was flailing its limbs pathetically on the floor, still impaled to the spot. He looked over the weapons rack, tilting his head curiously as he surveyed each of the weapons on it. August looked around at the crowd who were going wild, cheering for William. They clearly hadn't sensed it yet. They weren't feeling that churning in their gut like he was. "Keep your guard up," said Cain suddenly, now having his own sword drawn and at the ready. August nodded, realizing that Cain had sensed it too. Something wasn't right. There was a feeling in the air that August couldn't quite put his finger on. It was a subtle feeling of dread creeping into his heart, but it didn't feel like it was because of the monster. William picked up a spear from the weapon rack, holding it out in one hand and assessing it with a tilted head as he slowly made his way back over towards the impaled creature. August felt relief flow through him as he watched William preparing to end this. So why was it, with the battle all but won, that he could still not shake this uneasy feeling? William slowly lowered the spear down onto the moorcrawler's exposed belly. The crowd was going wild, waiting for him to make his final blow to finish the fight. He dragged the spear lightly across the creature's belly until suddenly he started to dig into its flesh, twisting his spear as it entered into its abdomen. The monster squirmed and writhed on the ground as the spear penetrated deeper into its body. The crowd erupted, cheering for William as he finally ended the battle, but he wasn't done yet. He pulled the spear out, running it down its belly again before piercing once again into its abdomen, creating a fresh wound to torment the moorcrawler. It continued to writhe helplessly in agony on the floor at the mercy of William. Some of the cheers from the crowd were beginning to die down a little as they began to realize what they were actually watching. "Come on, William, it's time to end this," yelled August uneasily, looking around at the crowd. William suddenly pulled the spear up, slashing it down across the wrist of one of the moorcrawler's arms, chopping its hand clean off. He didn't register August's words at all, continuing to walk around the moorcrawler, watching it struggle and squirm. He suddenly slashed out again, chopping off an arm this time. The creature squealed as it was slowly disassembled. William continued around the monster like this, making minor cuts and lacerations, slowly cutting off more and more of its appendages as his expression grew darker and darker. "William," said August, looking around at the crowd who were by now growing mostly silent. William suddenly squatted down by its head, putting his own face up against it and staring it in the eyes. He stared into its black eye sockets, watching as it squirmed and moaned from its torture. It was only now that the crowd drew entirely silent. As the monster's limbs continued to bleed out, the writhing finally began to cease. As William stood up, August raised his eyebrows with surprise. The expression on William's face was not one of excitement or sadistic glee. He looked disappointed. With one final brutal slash from his spear, he beheaded the monster. As sporadic applause slowly began to break out again, there was largely silence over the arena as everybody came to terms with the sadistic display that they'd just been witness to. Despite the creature being a monster from the gateway, most of the crowd didn't seem sure whether to applaud or not. So August let out a sigh, wanting to lower his sword, yet an instinct incited him to keep it readied. The fight was over. William had won. So why was it that he still couldn't shake that feeling in his gut that something wasn't quite right?